Maria in Saskatoon stares at her nearly empty pantry. The bare shelves, a stark reminder of how tight things have become. Reaching for her last box of pasta, she glances at her phone. The banking app shows just $12.47 in her account. Bills are scattered across the kitchen counter, each one stamped with red, bold letters, "Final Notice." "Mom, what's for dinner?" Her 8-year-old daughter calls from the living room. Maria closes her eyes, fighting back tears, because she's always been that one that others counted on, the strong one, the provider. But now, she feels as empty as her pantry. Maybe you know that feeling. Perhaps it's not a pantry, but your bank account, or your emotional and relational reserves are running on empty because of the stress at work. How can we move forward when there seems to be nothing left? Well, what if there's more to life than running on empty? What if that very area in your life that you feel depleted in can become an area of greatest fulfillment, preparing you for something greater than you can imagine? Maria's story isn't unique. Right now, across Canada, families are feeling the pressure of resources running dry. A recent BMO study revealed something startling about our current reality. They found that 82% of Canadians are anxious about their overall financial situation. Think about that. 8 out of 10 people you pass on the street are carrying the weight of financial stress? The same study showed that 82% live with a constant fear of unknown expenses, 73% are stressed about housing costs, 67% of families, it's the daily expenses of raising children that keep them up at night, 64% wonder if they can keep up with monthly bills. Behind these numbers are real people, real families, trying to stretch resources that seem to be evaporating like morning dew. But here's what's fascinating. This isn't a new human experience. Almost 3,000 years ago, in a Middle Eastern village called Zarephath, a widow faced her own version of empty. Her story intersects with one of the most dramatic moments in Israel's history, during a devastating drought that had turned streams to dust and fields to wastelands. The drought wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a spiritual wake-up call for a nation that had turned away from God under King Ahab's leadership. In the midst of this crisis, God sent a man named Elijah, but he didn't send him to the wealthy, not to the powerful, but to a widow who was down to her last meal. Think about that. God chose to demonstrate his provision not through abundance, but through emptiness, not through overflowing storehouses, but through a nearly empty flour jar, not through someone who had it all together, but through someone who was at the end of her rope. This is relatable to many of us today because maybe like the 54% of Canadians, you are deeply concerned about the rising costs of living. Perhaps like half our nation, inflation has you wondering about how to make ends meet. Some of you might be among the 42% bracing for a possible recession. But what if these statistics aren't just numbers? What if they're pointing us to something deeper? What if, like the widow in Zarephath, our empty places aren't the end of the story, but the beginning of something extraordinary? Throughout the Bible, God has a pattern of showing up not when our resources are full, but when they're depleted, not when we have it all figured out, but when we're at our wits' end, not when we're strong, but when we're empty. Today, we're going to look at how God met a widow at her point of emptiness and how He wants to meet us at ours. Whether your pantry is empty like Maria's, your bank account is drained, or your emotional reserves are running dry, there is hope. Because there's more to life than watching your resources run dry. There's more to life than anxiety about tomorrow. And sometimes our greatest emptiness becomes the stage for God's greatest miracles. Here's a little background to help us understand the context of this story. Before meeting the widow at Zarephath, Elijah appears suddenly in 1 Kings chapter 17, confronting King Ahab of Israel. This was a very dark period in Israel's history. Ahab had just married Jezebel, a Phoenician princess, and had led Israel into widespread Baal worship. Baal was considered the storm god, supposedly controlling rain and fertility. In a direct challenge to Baal's supposed power, Elijah declares to Ahab in 1 Kings chapter 17 verse 1, "As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, the God I serve, there will be no dew or rain during the next few years until I give the word." Now, this wasn't just another weather forecast. It was a direct confrontation between the true God of Israel and Baal. After this declaration, God tells Elijah to hide by the Cherith brook, east of the Jordan. There, God provides for him in an unusual way. Ravens bring him bread and meat twice a day, and he drinks from the brook. However, eventually, the brook dries up because of the drought. It's at this critical moment that God sends Elijah to Zarephath. And here's what's fascinating. Zarephath was in Phoenician territory, which was at the heart of Baal worship and Jezebel's homeland. God didn't send Elijah to a faithful Israelite widow. He sent him to a Gentile heathen widow in Baal's territory. So when Elijah meets this widow, he's a wanted man because Ahab is searching for him. He's deep in enemy territory during a drought that he announced, being sent to depend on someone who seemingly has nothing to give. This context makes the story even more powerful because God is demonstrating His provision and power not just to Elijah and the widow, but making a statement right in Baal's backyard. When Elijah meets this widow, he doesn't begin with sympathy. He doesn't start with comfort either. Instead, he makes what seems like an impossible request. The Bible says, as he arrived at the gates of the village, he saw a widow gathering sticks, and he asked her, "Would you please bring me a little water in a cup?" As she was going to get it, he called her, "Bring me a bite of bread too." 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 10 and 11. Now, in the middle of a drought, he's already asking for something precious. But then he adds, "And please bring me a piece of bread?" Her response? It's heartbreaking. "I swear by the Lord your God that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house. And I have only a handful of flour left in the jar and a little cooking oil in the bottom of the jug. I was just gathering a few sticks to cook this last meal, and then my son and I will die." Can you hear the sadness in her voice? This isn't just empty resources. This is empty hope. She's already accepted what she believes is the inevitable. Some of you might be there right now. You've done the math. You've checked the accounts. You've counted the cost. And like this widow, you don't see a way forward. But watch what happens next. Elijah says something that honestly sounds a little cruel. He says, "Don't be afraid. Go ahead and do just what you've said. But make a little bread for me first. Then use what's left to prepare a meal for yourself and your son." 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 13. Author and theologian Eugene Peterson puts it this way: the work of God is often found in the places where we have given up our last hope. This widow is being asked to give from her emptiness, to pour out from what's already running dry. Then comes this remarkable promise. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel says, there will always be flour and olive oil left in your containers until the time when the Lord sends rain and the crops grow again. Notice something interesting. God doesn't promise to fill her jar to overflowing. He doesn't promise wealth or abundance. He promises what she needed, just enough flour and oil for each day. And sometimes, we're looking for God to solve all of our problems at once, when He's actually more interested in teaching us daily dependence. There are three profound principles we discover in this encounter. The first principle is that only empty vessels can be filled. When the widow reached the end of her resources, that's when God showed up. Like a jar that must be empty before it can be filled with something new, our places of depletion often become the sacred spaces where God reveals His faithfulness in unexpected ways. The second principle is that provision often requires action. The miracle didn't happen while the flour sat in the jar. It happened in the pouring out, in the using, in the giving. Sometimes we're just waiting for God to change our circumstances before we step out in faith, when the reality is that God is waiting for us to step out in faith before He fills us up. The third and final principle is that God's economy operates differently. In our world, we hold on to what we have and save for what we need. But God's economy often works backwards. We give first to receive. We empty to be filled. The widow had to pour out her last meal to receive God's provision. Throughout the Bible, we see this pattern. The seed dies to produce life. Weakness becomes strength, and emptiness makes room for fullness. It doesn't make sense to our natural minds, but it's how God's kingdom operates. There's a powerful detail that's easy to miss in this story. In verses 15 to 16, it says, "So she did as Elijah said, and she and Elijah and her family continued to eat for many days. There was always enough flour and olive oil left in the containers, just as the Lord had promised through Elijah." Every day, not a month's supply, not a year's worth, every day there was enough. The widow didn't have certainty. What she had was courage. The courage to trust, to pour out, to believe that emptiness wasn't the end of her story. Your empty places, whether they're financial, emotional, or spiritual, they're not a surprise to God. They might actually be an invitation to trust Him in ways you've never had before. It's an invitation to see His provisions show up in ways you never expected. Remember, the widow's miracle didn't happen at the marketplace. It didn't happen at the bank. It happened in her kitchen with the little she had left. And so right where you are, with whatever little you have left, that's where God wants to meet you. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Remember in verse 16, we read that there was always enough flour and olive oil left in the containers, just as the Lord had promised to Elijah? This wasn't just about food. This was about God's faithfulness to His word. You see, in Hebrew culture, flour and oil weren't just cooking ingredients. They were symbols of God's blessings and provision. Author and theologian Walter Brueggemann points out that the miracle isn't just in the multiplication of resources, but in the daily reminder that God can be trusted. Think about this widow's daily routine. Every morning she would go to that jar and that jug, probably holding her breath, maybe wondering, is this the day it runs out? But day after day, she found enough. Not abundance, not excess, just enough. You might be living from paycheck to paycheck. Some of you are running on emotional fumes. Some of you feel spiritually depleted. Can I suggest something? Maybe God isn't interested in filling your jar to the brim right now. Maybe He's more interested in teaching you to trust Him one day at a time. But let's be honest, this isn't easy, is it? Living with uncertainty goes against everything in our culture that tells us to be self-sufficient, to have our lives figured out, to maintain the appearance that we've got it all together. The widow's story challenges our modern mindset in three specific ways. First, it challenges our definition of security. We think security comes from having enough stored up. God says security comes from knowing who your provider is. The widow's source of provision wasn't the flour and oil, it was God who provided them. Second, it challenges our understanding of timing. We want God to show up before we run out, but He often waits until we're empty. Why? Because that's when we know without a doubt that it was Him who filled us. Third, it challenges our view of community. Notice that the widow's provision came in the context of serving others. She had to feed Elijah first. Sometimes our breakthrough is connected to how we serve others even in our own time of need. Financial expert Dave Ramsey often says God's provision in your life is not just for you, it's to flow through you to help others. Even in her scarcity, this widow became a channel of God's provision to others. Here's something profound to consider. This widow didn't know she was going to be written about in the Bible. She didn't know that her story would become something to encourage people thousands of years later. She was just trying to survive one more day. But God had a bigger plan. In the same way, your current season of emptiness might be preparing you for something you can't yet see. Your story, God's provision, might become someone else's source of hope. As Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 1 verse 4, he says, He comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort others. When they are troubled, we will be able to give them the same comfort God has given us. The widow's story doesn't end with just survival. In the verses that follow, we see God uses Elijah to bring her son back to life. But that's a story for another day. The point is this: God wasn't just interested in keeping her alive. He was preparing her for an even greater demonstration of His power, because your empty places don't disqualify you from God's provision. They actually position you for it.
Have you ever asked these questions? Why am I here? Is there a God? Why is there so much evil and suffering? And why are there so many different religions, and which one is true? Is the Bible fact or fiction? Who is Jesus of Nazareth? Was He truly God, as Christians say He is? And why did Jesus come to earth to die? And how does His death offer us salvation? What happens when I die? Is there really a heaven or hell? These questions and others we answer on our online Bible study platform at hopestudy.ca. There, you will find answers to these and other life-changing questions. If you have any questions, please email us at hopestudy@hopetv.ca. God bless you. See you there.
Looking at the story of Elijah and the widow, here are 3 reflective questions to help you when you feel empty. Number 1, what are your empty jars right now? Where do you feel most depleted in your life? What keeps you up at night? How is this emptiness affecting other areas of your life? What fears surface when you think about your empty places? The widow didn't hide her situation. She named it with raw honesty. Like 82% of Canadians facing financial anxiety today, you might be feeling the weight of empty bank accounts. Or perhaps it's your emotional reserves that are depleted after a difficult season. Naming your emptiness isn't defeat. It's just the first step toward positive change. Number 2, What do you already have in your house? What resources, talents, maybe abilities are you overlooking? What opportunities are right in front of you? What experiences have prepared you for this moment? What small step could you take today with what you already have? God didn't ask the widow to go shopping. He started with her handful of flour and a little oil. Too often we wait for more before stepping out in faith. More money, more time, more strength. But God is asking you today, what's already in your house? Finally, number 3, where might God be showing up unexpectedly in your life? Who has God placed in your path recently? What unusual opportunities have presented themselves? Which closed doors led to better opportunities? What challenges have actually protected you? How have past difficulties equipped you for today? And what situations have you dismissed because they didn't match your expectations? You know, the widow never imagined her breakthrough would come through a hungry prophet asking for her last meal. Sometimes our provision comes packaged in ways we might not expect them to. The Bible says, "And this same God who takes care of me will supply all your needs from His glorious riches, which have been given to us in Christ Jesus." Philippians chapter 4, verse 19. Just as this promise sustained the widow through her daily provision, it reminds us that our empty places might be preparing us for a demonstration of God's faithfulness we can't see yet. The widow's story teaches us something profound about seasons of emptiness. They often precede seasons of abundance. Think about it. If the widow's jar had been full, she might never have experienced the miracle of endless provision. If her situation hadn't been desperate, she might never have discovered the depth of God's care. Your current situation or your current season of emptiness might be setting the stage for something amazing, probably your greatest testimony. So as you face your own empty places this week, stay open to God's unexpected ways of providing. Look for the small ways He's already at work, like the unexpected phone call, the encouragement at just the right time, the surprising opportunity. Remember, the widow's provision didn't come as a year's supply all at once. It came day by day, meal by meal, moment by moment. And your journey through this season might become the very hope someone else needs. Like the widow, your story of emptiness becoming filled might become more than just your personal provision. It could become a source of hope that fills others and helps them to trust God with their own seasons of emptiness. Also, remember, the widow didn't walk her journey alone. She had both Elijah and her son. Community is crucial when we're facing empty places. That's why I want to invite you to connect with me on this journey. Follow More to Life on social media, where you can message me directly with questions, share your story with me, or just find encouragement for your journey. Whether you're staring at your empty jar today or taking the first step of faith, you don't have to walk this path alone. Together, we can encourage each other to trust God, even when, especially when, we're running on empty.
If you haven't already partnered with us as an agent of hope, I want to share with you how you can do so. Above all, we need your prayers. Pray that these programs will speak to the hearts of people all across Canada. Also, any time that you have to spare in order to volunteer with one of our projects will be greatly appreciated. Lastly, your financial support would be greatly appreciated. You can make a one-time or a recurring donation. Thank you once again for joining us on this exciting journey of sharing hope across Canada and beyond.
In 1946, Truett Cathy and his brother Ben opened a tiny diner called the Dwarf Grill in Georgia. They had just $10,000 that they borrowed and an old grill. The restaurant was small, and like our widow gathering sticks, Truett was working with what little he had, cooking chicken, serving customers, and barely making ends meet. But something changed when he discovered a pressure cooker that could prepare a chicken sandwich in the same time it took to make a fast food hamburger. Working with just what he had in his tiny kitchen, he experimented until he created a special seasoning and cooking method. Like the widow's handful of flour and oil, it didn't seem like much at the time. But today, that single recipe that started in a tiny diner has grown into Chick-fil-A, a company that provides for thousands of families through its restaurants. What began as a small grill and alone has become a testimony of how God can multiply our beginnings when we're faithful with what we have. As a review, today we discovered 3 transformative truths from the widow at Zarephath. First, we learned that empty places can become holy ground. That kitchen where the widow thought she was preparing her last meal became a sacred place. Your place of emptiness, whether it's a depleted bank account, an emotional drought, or spiritual exhaustion, might be the very spot where God shows up in power. Second, we saw that God often works with what we have, not what we wish we had. The widow didn't need to go shopping. She just needed to trust God with her handful of flour and little oil. What seems insufficient in our hands becomes more than enough in His. Third and finally, we discovered that God's provision often comes packaged in unexpected ways. Who would have thought that a hungry prophet asking for a widow's last meal would become her source of endless supply? Sometimes our breakthroughs arrive disguised as a challenge. Remember, you're not just gathering sticks for your last meal. You might be gathering kindling for your next miracle. Those bills you're sorting through, they might become your testimony of God's provision. That tough situation you're facing, it might be the setup for an incredible comeback story. We saw how Jesus Himself demonstrated this principle, emptying Himself completely so that we might be filled. He knows what it means to pour out everything, to trust the Father completely. And because He did, we can trust Him with our own empty places. And so, like the widow, you have a choice to make when you finish watching this episode. Will you see your empty jar as the end of your story or as the beginning of a miracle? Will you view your gathered sticks as preparation for your last meal or as kindling for your next breakthrough? Because here's the truth. There is more to life than running on empty. There's more to your story than your current chapter of scarcity. With God, emptiness is often the prelude to abundance, and our end becomes His beginning. What empty jar is God asking you to trust Him with today?